Hello and welcome to our discussion of Lesson 12, where we learn the irregular verb aimi, be, and we learn about enclitics. So first off, the verb aimi, which means to be, is not an omega verb like all the regular verbs we've looked at before. It is a me verb. And more than that, it's an irregular me verb. So we're not going to talk a ton about me verbs right now. You're just going to have to memorize the forms of a me. Later on, we'll learn more me verbs. So here's the present indicative active of a me, be, Amy, a, este, esmen, este, ase. Okay? The stem of this verb really is s. And you can see that here, here, and here. In the first person singular, second person singular, and third person plural, the S has dropped out. And then to make up for the missing S, we get compensatory lengthening. So the epsilon lengthens to epsilon iota. Okay? So that's the present indicative active. Here's the present imperative active. Iste, esto, este, eston. And the present infinitive active, ani. Okay, this final I counts as short for purposes of accentuation, which is why it's accented with a circumflex. And you can see there's some compensatory lengthening going on there as well. Now here's the imperfect indicative active. So first person singular, a or ain, I was being, aestha, ain, amen, eta or aesta, asan. Now the future indicative is deponent. It has middle forms, but they have active meanings. So we'll talk a little bit more about deponent in a sec. Let's look at the forms. Esomai, esse or esse, estai, esomata, essesta, esontai. Okay, so you can recognize those middle endings there, but it gets translated actively. Esomai, I will be, esse, you will be. And the future infinitive is also deponent. It also looks like a middle form, but is translated actively. Essestai, to be, about to be. Now, a little bit more about deponents. Deponent verbs have non-active forms but active meanings. So Amy esomai, that's the first two principal parts, is an example of it, of a deponent verb. And you can tell it's deponent just looking at the principal parts because the second principal part looks middle. It's a middle form. And in fact, akuo here and phogo, flee, are also deponents in the same way. You can look at akusamai, puksamai, right? I shall hear, I shall flee. Now, one more thing about Amy, most of the present indicative active is enclitic. And you may have noticed when we first looked at it that the accents are funny. Most verbs have recessive accents. In fact, most forms of Amy are recessive. But the present indicative active, you can see that all these forms, which are all enclitic, are accented on their ultima. This one is not enclitic. Second person singular isn't enclitic, but the other five forms here are enclitic. Well, what does that mean? Enclitics are words that lean on the word before them. That cli root there is the same one you see in cline, bed, right? It's a place you lie down. So enclitics lean on the word before them. They're kind of like little parasites attaching themselves to the word before them. And the accent of an enclitic will either vanish be given to the ultima of the previous word, or appear on the ultima of the enclitic itself. So when we learn the forms of a, me, the enclitic forms, they come, in a chart with an acute on the ultima, but that's not actually where the accent's always going to be. All right, so let's look at how enclitics affect the accentuation of the preceding word. If the word before an enclitic has an accent on its ultima, that accent will remain as it was. Acute accents don't turn into graves, and the accent of the enclitic will vanish. So let's look at the word agathos. It's accented on its ultima, and when followed by the enclitic ge means indeed. It sort of makes the word before it emphatic. So agathos followed by ge, the accent stays and acute. Now look at this example. We have tone, the definite article, with a circumflex, followed immediately by ge. The accent stays a circumflex. And again, the ge has no accent of its own. If the word before an enclitic has an acute on its antepenult or a circumflex on its penult, that accent remains and the word will get an extra acute on its ultima. So the word douloi starts off with a circumflex on its penult. When you follow it with the enclitic ge, it gets an extra accent there, an extra acute on its ultima. So it actually has two accents in a row, a circumflex and then an acute. Or the word anthropoi. Anthropoi has an acute on its antepenult, and when it's followed by the enclitic, it gets another accent, another acute on its ultima. Okay? The reason for this, the logic behind this, is if you imagine that the enclitic sort of becomes a part of the word. If you have a word of this shape with just a circumflex, right, and no other accent, what you really have in effect is a circumflex on the antepenult, right? Ultima, penult, antepenult. And that violates the basic rules for accentuation. Circumflexes can't appear that far back in a word, and so we add another accent. So too, if you imagine anthropoi, right, with an accent, an acute on its antepenult, when you add this extra syllable there, now the acute is on the fourth syllable from the end, and that's too far back, so we add another acute there. Okay, finally, if the word before the enclitic has an acute on its penult, the accent of a one-syllable enclitic will vanish. So, for example, pille, right? Pille, it's got an acute right there on its penult. So when you follow it with a monosyllabic enclitic, that's okay, right? That doesn't violate the rules for accent, so nothing has to change. But if you follow it with a disyllabic enclitic, then we have a problem. So this example, pilloi esnen, right? So here we have an acute on the penult, and when you follow it with a disyllabic enclitic, right? Let's count back. Ultima, penult, antepenult. So the accent is way back there. So that's when we add an accent to the ultima of the disyllabic enclitic. Okay? Note that this accent, this acute, when followed directly by another word, becomes a grave. Okay? Let's look at this one, right? Tinon, that's another enclitic. Okay? So, ton hippon tinon. Again, we have an accent on the penultive hip bone, followed by this disyllabic enclitic. So this accent's too far back, right? This is the antepenult, so this is before that. So we have to add another accent. Here, it's a circumflex over a short syllable. It's going to be an acute that can turn into a grave, followed by another word. Over a long vowel or a diphthong, it becomes a circumflex. And that's it.